I'm John Travis in Novato, California on July 27th, 2025, talking to James Riley just outside of Cambridge, England. Um, and good morning or good evening. It's morning here and
Mhm.
early evening there. Um, I'll introduce a little bit of out of the blue. I got an email from Ken Pelletier urging me to check out this book last year. And somehow or other, you found out more stuff about me than I thought that was available online. Uh, 50 years after all my wellness stuff, you're acknowledging it. And you weren't even born then. So uh, since then, we've had some conversations, scoured through the book, and uh, you got the copy there you can hold up. And
Yeah, there it is.
I couldn't,
Well-beings.
my copy was sitting out here on the desk, couldn't find it anywhere. We just searched the house. It's gotten buried. So um, there it is. The subtitle is um, How the 70s, well, you can say it better.
Yes, how the 70s lost its mind and taught us to find ourselves. That's the subtitle.
Yes.
Well-beings is the main title.
And I was pleasantly surprised to find 200 references to my work in 1978, 77, back in those days. So I naturally wanted to find out who is this guy and what's his interest in all this stuff so much later, along with Sarah McFadden's
Mhm.
the serial that was a real fun event at the time. So um, it's a little bit of background of why I'm interviewing you, because normally I interview people that are going to die or have died since I've interviewed them, because the old guard wellness people are like me, 80s and 90s. A lot of them have preceded me in being able to record them. But what I'd like to do is start with your birth, your parents, what got you interested in this. I gather they sort of hippie parents that
Yeah,
from
sort of,
my
sort of,
generation.
sort of.
Um,
Yeah.
but let us give us some background on what
Yeah.
led you to all this.
Okay, well, great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you last time. And I really appreciated you getting in touch. And it's really been really, one of the great byproducts of a project like this that you get to meet people and talk to people, and it's a great honor and a great pleasure. In terms of just getting into this, well, if I went back to the kind of early years, I'm English. I'm from the north of England, Lancashire. I was born in 1981, so you're absolutely right. I was not born when all these things were happening. Um, I'm also my specialty is, I'm not a practitioner of wellness by trade. I'm not trained in any of those areas. So again, you might think, what am I actually doing here? My professional and intellectual and creative training is in literary studies. I went to university again in the north of England as a result of becoming very interested in books and literature. I studied at a place called Lancaster University, did a BA and an MA there, and then started graduate work, postgraduate work at the University of Cambridge. Um, and my interests were always in the more modern side of things, 20th century, modern and contemporary. And I was very interested for a very long time in the 1960s and the 1970s, sort of post-war period, broadly speaking, counterculture, and so on and so forth. So the projects, a lot of the academic projects I've done since then have exhibited that interest, and I now work at the University of Cambridge at Girton College. I'm Fellow of English there at Girton College. In terms of just slightly more kind of personal interest, you said kind of hippie parents. I suppose, yeah, I suppose hippie-ish parents. I think my dad certainly was veering more towards them. He used to tell me that he was the first person in his hometown to have long hair in the 60s. He used to play in a band, this kind of thing. He had a friend who was certainly a sort of Northern England beatnik who used to sit at home in his flat with a table with the sawn off legs, playing clarinet in the dark. That was the kind of thing that he used to do. Um, um, but there was always a lot of stuff in the house. Obviously a lot of books in the house, a lot of things linked to literature, which are things that often had a slightly countercultural or underground bent. There was a book growing up called A Year of Health and Beauty by Beverly and Vidal Sassoon from the 1970s, which was there as a kind of fixture of of my child. It was just something that I was aware of, but latterly, when I was looking through it and talking to my mother about it, there was a lot in there about the Esalen Institute, about different kinds of yoga, about healthy living, diets, meditation. So there's a lot of kind of 70s culture moving in and out of that book. My dad and my grandmother were also book dealers and antique dealers for a lot of their professional lives. So my sister and I, we sort of have very strong memories of growing up with a lot of sort of 60s and 70s objects, kind of the sort of detritus of, as it were, of that period. My grandmother used to have a second-hand shop in our hometown, and on the wall was the print that I mentioned a few times in the book, the sort of stereotypical mass-marketed print of the 1970s, Wings of Love, um, which is the sort of chessboard tidal area, naked man and woman, gigantic swan coming in. So that was it was so there was a kind of early fascination with the popular culture of the 1960s and the 1970s, which once I got the opportunity to do so at a postgraduate level and then at a professional level, I very much pursued. Um,
Let's go back to your birth and like
yeah,
your sister older or younger? Or were you the
yeah, 5 years older, my sister. Yeah.
okay? So you were the second of just the two of you, or
Just
there?
the two, yeah. So I was born at the very start of the 1980s. My sister was born has a bit of experience in the 1970s, but yeah, I'm the younger of us.
And how old's your dad?
My dad now is 78,
Uh-huh. And your mom?
just a bit younger, 76.
And what what was her interests and
My mother had an interest in education. Before my sister and I were born, my mother and father both worked. They probably won't thank me for saying this, but they both worked, I suppose, very closely linked to alcohol. My father used to work in a brewery, and my mother used to work in what's called an off license, a sort of shop where you can just go in and buy kind of all kinds of alcohol and things. And they used to enthusiastically home brew and so on and so forth. But that kind of slipped away slightly when my sister and I came along. And my father worked in a number of sort of factory type jobs, but then he went working for himself, as I said, as a antique dealer, as a book dealer, and then latterly he actually worked in that capacity for Oxfam. Um, my mother, through the same period, started working for local schools in the area. She was a classroom assistant. She was working with people with school children with special needs. She was working with a lot of children from the traveller community who would move, who had a lot of the schools in our area were designated schools for children from traveller families. And sometimes their educational attendance could be a little bit disruptive. So my mother worked very closely with them for a number of years.
and for Americans who probably don't know what travelers are, I think I learned that that's a more politically correct word for gypsies. So what
Correct. So people from of the Romani identity would be
uh-huh.
the more politically correct. But traveller is also a more of a cultural phrase in the sense of yes, they travel around. So you either have very limited education or quite disrupted education. So the schools in which my mother worked, she was often working very closely with children from traveller families or children with other learning needs of one form or another, and she did that for a very long time, effectively employed by Lancashire County Council.
Uh-huh.
So they were both passionately interested in culture, if you like, education. When my father had worked a long time for himself as a book dealer, antiques dealer, when that was becoming I mean, the industry sort of became a little less viable towards the mid 90s onwards. But he also had a very big desire to formalize his own education. That had been disrupted because of him being undiagnosed dyslexic as a child. So my father went back to university as a mature student. He did a BA and an MA. So there was a time where my sister was going to university. I was beginning to think about going to university. My father was going to university at the same time, and my mother was very extremely involved in the kind of earlier stage of education. So there was a period of
Wow.
time in the house where it was very, very, very focused on the importance of education and thinking about it from loads of different viewpoints. And of course, we had also grown up surrounded by all kinds of books, and not just sort of the literary classics, but strange, pulp paperbacks, all kinds of other things that had, the sort of the tangibility of previous decades was very much there, which I suppose accounts for the personal interest. But just in terms of parental upbringing, education was paramount. Bettering yourself was paramount. The importance of it in terms of one's own self-development was
Mhm.
was also paramount, which I think instilled and that coupled with both my parents effectively sort of forging their own careers of one form or another. They were extremely good in fostering a personal interest. If you're interested in XYZ, a lot of books on the subject would appear. But also fostering the importance of um, like the power of being, if you like, intellectually independent, of finding out your own interests and really developing them. Um, and the way in which education and the persistence of it, beyond primary school, beyond secondary school, whatever, the importance of that for your own growth. I think that was very important in terms of what my parents were about, really. Plus, a work ethic. They both
Yeah.
worked extremely hard, and I think my sister and I both inherited that being the input. Like, no one's going to give you anything, so if you want something, you have got to work extremely hard for it.
What was your relationship like with Big Sis? Did she treat you well
Great.
or?
Oh, great, great, great. I mean, she has two boys, and there's not much between them, and they're wonderful and they're lovely, but sometimes you can see a little bit of sibling rivalry. But I think with me and my sister, because there's 5 years between us,
That's a
I mean,
perfect
by the
time.
time, yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant, because by the time I came along, she was already her own person. She
Yeah.
was already her own interest had developed. I wasn't a rival.
Yeah.
There was nothing for me to kind of threaten, or take any attention away, and there was no real sort of competition between us because we were, you know, we were sort of encouraged to go in our own direction. So none that sibling rivalry didn't really happen.
Yeah.
The antagonism didn't really happen. So yeah, it was great. Perfect childhood, really. It was full of a lot of love, nurturing, a lot of support, and I think overall we were a very tight unit, tight crew.
Wonderful. And where were you living in the city, an apartment, a house in the country,
I
or?
live in a house where my parents still live at the moment, to this day. It's in Lancashire. It's a little town. I mean, I don't know if you, I mean, we've talked about this before. Manchester is probably the nearest big
Uh-huh.
city, and we're about half an hour away from there in a town called Accrington, which may possibly be familiar with us in terms of their famous football team, who are famous for not being very good, Accrington Stanley. And
Nope, it didn't.
Accrington is a sort of, say again, sorry.
It hasn't reached the
Oh
California
no, it's a
shores.
bit. They're a kind of a cult football team in the UK. Um, but yeah, Accrington is like a mid-sized town. It's not a city. There's a lot of it borders on fabulous countryside. Very very working class. It's I thought it was a great place to grow up, really. And my parents used to say about when they moved there, they thought it was their take on it was, it was a good sort of human-sized place. It wasn't too big, it wasn't too small. There's always other places to go very quickly. You don't have to go very far, and you're in sort of countryside, but it's kind of got everything you need. So that was a good environment to grow up in.
Did you have a yard to play in, or kids in the neighborhood and sandlot, what we call sandlot sports here?
Yeah, there's a lot of that at school. We had a little yard at the back, a little garden at the front. But I think in just in terms of my own perspective, which I think is indicative in terms of where the kind of thing that I'm doing. I'm always preferred my own company. I wouldn't necessarily say that I was a loner, but I prefer just doing my own thing. And rather than kind of like running around outside or whatever, which we did some of that, but I think I was always at kind of my happiest when I was kind of on my own doing something at my own pace that I was
Mhm.
very interested in, whether that was reading or collecting things or making little books and little comic books or whatever. That was, or, collecting stuff. That was always the stuff that I like to do rather than getting out and playing football or whatever. You know. So I think that was good training for the the hours of
Academic life.
isolation that were to
Yeah.
come. It's fine. I mean, I don't think I was necessarily maladjusted, but I always preferred and very much, and I've increasingly, valued time on my own.
Uh-huh. And now your schooling, what we call elementary school, is
Mm.
it primary? What is the terminology in England for
It's
the
primary and
primary?
then secondary. Primary, you have like 7 years. Secondary school is 5 years. Then you go and take your what's called A levels
Uh-huh.
for 2 years, and then if you want from there, you go to university, which I suppose. Well, and the slight confusing terminology is we would call A levels colloquially, we would call it going to college.
Uh-huh.
Whereas that's not when although the term college is certainly in use when you think about Cambridge University, going to university is probably what you would do after college in the UK,
Right.
if you see what I mean.
And how was school, primary school for you? Do you have any particular interests, friends, activities?
Yeah, I think so. I got on again at my tendency to be slightly on my own. I think was I can kind of root it back to primary school, and I don't really see that in a necessarily a bad way or indicative of any kind of problem. But when I think back to primary school, I can see myself just going off into a corner and sort of doing my own thing. Not probably not the best mixer.
You weren't running for class president then.
Well, I enjoyed doing things like that. When I got to secondary school, I enjoyed doing things like being on the school council and
Ah,
getting involved. And a friend that I had, one of the friends that I had at primary school, who's probably my best friend at the time, he and I went to secondary school together, same secondary school, and we ended up being head and deputy head boy. So I liked that kind of thing. I just never really liked the idea of, or never really got on well with the idea of a big group of mates, as we would
uh-huh.
put it here in the UK. I think maybe there was a sort of slight aversion to, um, I suppose, a certain kind of masculine working class culture that I was seeing around, certainly
Yeah.
around the town that I was growing up, which was very sort of sport focused, very sort of drinking focused. Um, and you could see that at an embryonic level amongst children who were sort of almost kind of graduating towards that. And I didn't really want any of that. So I tended just to sort of keep my own
How big
company.
were your class, like the class of whatever?
Yeah. 30 usually. You usually have a class about 30. And that was fairly persistent all the way through school until I got to university, where it went down to about 10. But they were always fairly sizable.
And the size of the school, like the particular whatever uh,
Mm.
grade you were in, what how many? Like we were only 46 graduating in my little high school, but
All right.
how many
Well, I
did?
think at primary school, yeah, we had a couple of hundred. I think there's about 200 and something at primary school. I think there's about 500 other kids at secondary school. And of course, we got to bigger numbers, 800 at A level, and then obviously a massive student population at university. So it was, there were big groups, a lot of people around. I think my secondary school was probably, I think my some of my memories of secondary school are of very crowded corridors and very crowded rooms. I think that's when the school was built. It wasn't built to occupy the number of people that were actually there when I got there. So
Ah,
it was quite packed out, I remember.
and your interests were still literature, English, and
Yeah, I like books. I was really into comic books. I really was very interested in American culture. I liked films. I liked to make my own films for quite a while. I liked things like science fiction and horror films, stuff like that. Things were a little bit offbeat because I liked the idea of. I never really liked the idea of liking what everyone else liked because I always thought you just being given that.
yeah.
It's just someone has told you that you've got to like this band or this clothes or these clothes or football because it's just what everyone else does. And I was just like, well, I'll go and find. It's not. I wasn't sort of like say rejecting it because it was popular. It was just like, well, it's been spoon fed. Go and find your own stuff. And what I liked about the things that I was into just as hobbies, as things that I liked. It felt like I'd sort of dug them up myself. I'd gone away and found them. And I really liked that kind of research element. And I used to really like, say, go into some flea market or something, some secondhand shop, finding a book or a videotape or something that I'd never come across before, and then trying to find out something about where it had come from. I really liked that kind of, I suppose, the sort of, it's almost a kind of popular cultural archaeology sort of thing. I just really liked finding out more about what I was interested in, and I didn't really like just going along with something else because someone else had said it was really popular. So again, I suppose that I often found myself in sort of circles of one or very kind of like smallish groups of very, sort of particular interests. But yeah, films, books, comic books, popular culture, I suppose, I was very interested in.
So you went to university in Northern England,
Yeah,
or
Northern England, Lancaster University, not that far away from where I grew up. My sister went there as well, just before me. She did theology and English, and then became a teacher, secondary school teacher. So I went there. I'd already seen the campus. I liked it a lot. It's a very nice environment, and I studied English there. I did a little other courses in history and American studies and so on and so forth. But I majored, as it were, in English literature. And it was good. It's Lancaster's a good campus. It's a nice light. It's a nice landscape, nice area. Really, really good English department. And it was a good training because they were very much invested in Shakespeare, a lot of Victorian literature, 18th century literature, and so on and so forth. So it was a good sort of basis in stuff that I'd not encountered before, and a great place to do master's research as well.
and then you did your master's there too, or
Yeah, I did. I did that, and I pushed that a little bit further. They had a course called um, Contemporary Literary Studies, which was much more in my representative where my interests were at that time. I was really interested in people like William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and all those
uh-huh.
kind of American beat writers. And that gave you the opportunity to do things which were a little bit more recent, a little bit more modern. There's a lot of encouragement to talk about film and stuff like that, and a lot of very interesting literary theory. We were taught all the sort of great French theorists on that course, which I really enjoyed. And it was my overriding kind of memory of Lancaster is just being introduced to stuff in a really exciting and exhilarating way that I never encountered before, much of which has kind of stayed with me as intellectual interests. So yeah, the master's year was there, and then I took a year out and then I went to Cambridge for the PhD.
What did you do on the year out? Travel or?
Well, I knew I wanted to. I was mulling over a PhD, and I really wanted to do it, but it was funding dependent. And I had a friend also at the time who was a year older than me, and she'd gone straight through a master's to a PhD. And I remember her telling me that she was kind of exhausted because she'd finished her master's in September the 30th and started her PhD in October the 1st. So that was kind of, but so I thought, well, maybe if I took a year out and I could get some money together through working. I could actually really properly get a decent proposal together for a PhD topic. And I thought I really needed experience just stuff other than university. So I took the opportunity of doing a little bit of travel as well. I went to Australia and went to America for a while, and then I came back and worked for some just sort of data information companies here in the UK and worked for solicitors for a while in between these larger trips. And I was just really just trying to decide, do I actually want to do a PhD? I was trying other things out, and because I found some of these other things so boring, I thought, actually, yes,
Mm.
I do want to do this. And I was trying to get decent funding applications together and a decent proposal together, and really properly think where I wanted to go, and try and get a bit of money together at the same time in case the funding didn't come together, and just really just try to get a contingency plan. So I think that's kind of stood me in good stead because I think the proposal that instead of applying during a master's year when I was trying to do everything else for that qualification, I applied halfway through a year out, and I think my proposal was a lot stronger because of that. Um, and then yeah, luckily, because I would not have been able to do it without, the funding did come through, and I started the PhD after that year. But I think it was time well spent. I did a lot of things that I wanted to do, and I think I was in a more sort of mature and independent position once I actually started the PhD.
Since I live in Australia half the year, I'm curious, where did you travel in Australia? We might have even crossed paths if.
Yeah, well, I went to New South Wales. I started off in Sydney,
Hmm.
spent a little bit of time just in Sydney, which was more kind of sightseeing and stuff, and then I joined a conservation group, Conservation Volunteers Australia, CVA, and we worked all in. Spent a few months working all around the New South Wales area. Spent a lot of time in Newcastle, that kind of place, working, sort of repairing fences, making pathways, working on like national parks. Spent some time in a eco lodge that I can't remember the name of now, but we were doing a lot of work there, making it a lot of repair work and sort of trail repair work and that kind of thing. So exactly, it was a series of circles, really. It wasn't sort of like spending 3 months traveling right across a massive territory. It was a series of peculiar circles in and around Sydney, sometimes the suburbs, sometimes the countryside, um, which I really liked actually, because I think if I'd have just gone there and joined some sort of gap yeary touristy thing, I just would have been seeing the local, youth hostel spots.
Didn't
But we
get up to
spent we
Byron
saw
Bay.
some. No, I didn't get to Byron Bay. Where I got to somewhere. Where else did it? Where did I go? There was I can't remember. Yeah, actually, no, I think I did because I spent the last week by the sea, and I made like a big claim that I wanted to go there. I think it was Byron Bay. Yeah, I think it was there.
It was
Um,
the surfer
but
dudes hang out there.
yes, I did spend. I took some surfing lessons in Newcastle, and tried to keep up with it while I was there, and tried to pretend that I knew what I was doing once I got to Byron Bay, which wasn't really the case. But the people that I was with, apparently they they said that they admired my determination for keep jumping back in, which I think was a very polite and diplomatic way of saying you're terrible at surfing, but good on you for keep jumping back in.
And where in the States did you travel?
I went to Alaska.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah, which was really good, really interesting, and a lot more
the one
kind
state
of
I've never
hard.
been to.
Yeah, well, that's where I wanted to go. It was quite. Yeah, I've always been interested by it, and it was a lot more hardcore than the Australia trip. It was ostensibly doing the same kind of thing. Went to Anchorage and then went up to Fairbanks, and we were doing a lot of work on the Iditarod Trail and
Mm.
on national parks and stuff like this. But yeah, it was a lot more sort of unforgiving as an atmosphere a sort of environment and.
Was it daylight when you were there, I hope?
Oh, I never saw the sun for months.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was really weird. It was, and I realized that in addition to the sort of visual and sort of cognitive peculiarities that comes with that, we were camping also. We were outside for this for intense for this trip, and it also meant that all the birds, all the animals, they were just the noise from them was just constant as well. There was perpetual movement outside the tent and perpetual bird song all the way.
In the dark.
Yeah, well, it never went dark.
Oh, I thought it was the other way around. You were
Yeah,
the summer.
yeah,
Okay.
we. Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry. I think I got that mixed up. Yeah, it never went dark for the duration that I was there. Yeah, it was perpetual sunlight.
Yeah. So you went to Cambridge for your PhD.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Good, good. It was great educationally, but it was, to be perfectly honest with you, it was a bit of a culture shock. Um, with I knew what it represented in terms of the status of it, the traditions of it, and so on and so forth. But it was very extremely different from Lancaster, not just in terms of it being an older place, internally, in terms of the actual study of literature, methodologically, the trajectory was completely different from the training that I had at Lancaster. There was a lot of the kind of educational focus was on interpretation and the politics of interpretation, like what's been implied by reading a text from a certain perspective and what might be a Marxist perspective or a feminist perspective and so on and so forth. So there's a lot. It was basically focused on how does one read texts and what are the potential politics of that. That was the whole focus of Lancaster. Um, but when I got to Cambridge, when you sat in seminars in the Cambridge English faculty, it was you could tell that the intellectual trajectory was very much evaluative. It was about trying to gauge value in terms of text. Is this a good text or not? And are these lines beautiful or not? And Cambridge still very saw itself very much as the sort of critical gatekeeper, and that judgment and that evaluation connected to the role of the literary critic was still very much in operation. That was pretty much what we spent 3 years questioning at Lancaster.
Wow, that
You know,
sounds very one-sided.
it is quite one-sided because the criteria was always very invisible. It was very difficult to understand, very difficult to get a sense of um, what exactly was the criteria underpinning the notion of value that was applied. And for the first term I was there, I was hearing all these terms which we'd interrogated at Lancaster, like beauty, like good, like correct, like authentic. I was hearing them all trotted out in a completely non-ironic way, you know, um, and not sort of unquestioned. And so that was a little bit that took a lot of sort of getting used to that different trajectory and that different that internal gyroscope of the place. Plus, of course, you had people who'd been there for 3 years as undergraduates already. I think joining an institution as a postgraduate is quite a particular experience. And so you'd often have these seminars where literal, very much literally, you, half of the people on one side of the room had already been to Cambridge for 3 years, and then on the other side of the room, there were the people who just got there, and they were both sort of slightly mutually suspicious of the other because the people who'd been at Cambridge for 3 years, they weren't with their friends anymore because not all of them had done postgraduate stuff, and then they didn't know anything about the people on the other side of the room, and then I was looking at these people and thinking, well, I've had nothing like your training. Um, So the seminar, I didn't find the seminars that supportive and harmonious. At Lancaster, it was very encouraging. It was like, great that you're interested in this. Cambridge was like, what's the value of that? You know?
Hmm.
Why are you bothering with this? There was less of the sort of fascination that you'd often get at Lancaster. If you brought something up in a seminar that no one had ever heard of, the response was, "Wow, that sounds really interesting. Tell us more about it." If you brought it up that no one had ever heard of at Cambridge, they would assume that they'd never heard of it because it's unimportant and thus not
Right.
valuable.
And what was your thesis title?
It was on beat writers. It was William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and a few others. And it was about how they made use of recording technology. I was initially going to do something about the way in which those writers had been represented in the media and about films based on their work. But then in the year out, I found out that they'd done a lot of, I was poking around and found out that they'd done a lot of private tape recordings. They'd used tape recorders to write with. These were not spoken word albums. They were they as they was composing a lot of their works. They'd been working with reel-to-reel tape recorders, and there was a lot of private and in some cases sort of unheard recordings in collections, archives, and so on and so forth. And I got really interested in that material, and I was very interested in combining that with looking at their manuscripts and their compositional work to see how they'd actually incorporated
Were these
these processes.
were they like dictating what they wanted to transcribe into text, or were they talks that they gave that were then more
Well, there's a mixture of it. Some of it was that. Some people like Allen Ginsberg was very interested in recording all his readings that he did, his poetry, public poetry readings. Kerouac did a little bit of that, but it was more, he came at it much more from almost the perspective of a speech therapist. He would record a conversation and then he would replay it, and he'd be fascinated by looking at the sort of switchbacks and the ways in which the conversation flowed. He would like to pick out what are the hinge points and the pivots that cause the conversation to go in one way rather than
Hmm,
another. And they would then record himself and um, um, Neil Cassidy, his kind of great friend. He would record him and Neil talking about the transcript of the conversation that they'd made. So it was less about sort of abandoning the text and talking instead, but it was about interrogating and analyzing the kind of conversations that we were having. But William Burroughs was using it was started off in a similar way, but he was a lot more rigorous and scientific, and he thought that language was a sort of virus. That was his main idea and sort of motif. And he thought that when you speak, it's not you that speaks, it's language that's speaking, which is a different entity. And he thought that if you could record your voice, get it out of the head and onto the tape, as he said, you could then manipulate it, chop it up, cut it around, get it to say things that it didn't intend. So he was a lot more interventionist and a lot more sort of avant-garde with the way in which he used the tape recorder.
that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I got exposed to that through Werner Erhard's work with
Oh, right. I see.
the Chilean guys, the two that he picked up their work
Hmm.
that in Allende's time. I've forgotten their names now,
Hmm. Hmm.
but the power of language and that
Hmm.
live in language and how everything begins as words, as ideas spoken, and
Hmm.
fascinating. So, you published the thesis then, and
I
or
published parts of it because it was I thought it was a decent thesis, but structurally it wouldn't have made a very good book because it was very much sort of like it was quite, we'll unpack this method, we'll apply it to this person, and there was a
Mhm.
lot of other case studies in it. So I published a big project based on a quarter of it. I worked on another guy called Peter Whitehead, who was a filmmaker and writer, sort of sandwiched between the two. And I had him in the project as a sort of case study of applying the stuff from Burroughs and
Mm.
Kerouac. I followed off the thesis with a big archive project on Peter Whitehead. I got to know him quite well before he passed away in 2019, and we did a big we did a big editorial project on all these manuscripts and stuff, which produced a lot of volumes and digitized
So
content and
he
stuff like
was
that.
English, I
He was
guess.
an English filmmaker. Yeah, he was born in Liverpool in the 1930s and came to prominence in the 1960s. But he was also interested in recording. He sort of said that if you he was associated with documentary and cinema verite, but he was also very much influenced by sort of European avant-garde authors who were questioning the validity and the veracity of language. So he would often, when people would come at him and say, "You're a great documentarian of the 1960s. Your film shows exactly what happened in the 1960s." He would say things like, "No, they're not accurate at all. My films also happened in the 1960s. It's a completely separate thing from when I shoot something, I turn it into something else. You're
Hmm.
not seeing the thing that happened. You're seeing what I made it into. It only appears to be the thing that happened." So a very interesting guy. Loads of material that hadn't really been published, and loads of material that showed him as a sort of developing writer over the 60s. So yeah, the thesis kind of gave birth to a whole Whitehead archive project, really, that became the sort of postdoctoral editorial project that took quite a long time. But yeah, that's what I did straight after the thesis, rather than going down the traditional line of publishing it straight away, which I think would have made for quite a choppy book. So in the interim, all that Burroughs stuff has been sort of gestating and growing and adding something to. So at some point, there will be a separate book on William Burroughs that sort of
It's
had its
12
origins in
o'clock.
the thesis, but it's actually quite different.
And this all eventually leads up to your first book, uh,
Yeah.
Bad Trip.
Yeah, it's called The Bad Trip. Yeah, this is. Yeah, I have it here. In fact, there it is.
Yeah,
Um,
I've read part of it. I
yeah,
was in med school during most of that time and missed it all. Had to go back to.
yeah. Well, there it is. Because when I was writing, I spent a while when I finished working with Peter Whitehead. Peter Whitehead is in this book quite a lot. Um, and I tried to work. I went back to developing the Burroughs stuff as a book, but I was always very interested in writing a sort of a non-fictiony thing about the 1960s, and particularly the end of the 1960s. 1969 into 1970. And I'd done some public lectures on this using the Whitehead material and some other stuff and talking about the Rolling Stones and Charles Manson and all that kind of stuff. And I had an offer from from an agent first, and then we worked together with the publisher to do a book about the end of the 60s, which was specifically designed to come out in 2019, 50 years since 1969, in
Oh,
the expectation that there will be a lot of press impact and press attention on that. So I'd been hacking away at various academic projects, very kind of forensic editorial projects, and lots of very dense academic articles based on the stuff that I was interested in. And this is a slightly different sort of language, non-fiction rather than an academic monograph. And it was an opportunity really to sort of narrativize some of these ideas, but also, question it. I was very interested in the whole idea that the 60s sort of collapsed into catastrophe, which is sometimes what you get from films and novels that are after the fact about it. So I was trying to question that, but also in some way tell the story of something like Charles Manson or Rolling Stones at Altamont, or a lot of the work that Peter Whitehead did. So um, there's quite a lot of it in there that I'm actually kind of narrativizing his movement through the decade, as well as sort of commenting on some of the work. So, it was a very enjoyable book to do, very interesting book to work on, but written in a completely different style from the academic work that I've been doing, and the sort of art of it, the kind of trick of it. We spent quite a long time, myself working with the agent and also then with the editor, to try and get the tone right. And the sort of art of it was to sort of talk about academic ideas, but in a fairly accessible style. So what I was trying to do was put together familiar and unfamiliar things, and I was trying to get a through line and a story that went in different directions, but was sort of carried on, and carried along by this analysis of key examples, more sort of academic stuff. So I'd call it kind of cultural history, really. And I think it did its job. When we were thinking about who we wanted to read this, I had in mind the kind of person who would be willing to spend £100 on a Rolling Stones box set,
Ah,
or whatever, but would buy the book at the same time. And we were talking about where we wanted it reviewed, and there's very long running magazines here in the UK. One called Classic Rock, and another one called Record Collector. And I thought, well, if I could get it reviewed in there, as well as things like the Sunday Times, we're probably doing well. And we did get it in both of those we did get in both of those sectors. I got the sort of non-fictiony review, great, and I also got the record fans getting involved in it too. So that was good. And that kind of like set up you know, there's a tone here, there's a way of writing, there's a kind of methodology. We can apply this elsewhere. So when I was doing this, yes, it was written for 2019. It was written for a very specific kind of market that we work quite hard on cultivating. But I always had in mind a kind of non-fiction trilogy, as it were. I wanted this to be the first of three books. Um, I wanted to do something on the 60s into the 70s. I wanted to do another book on the 70s into the 80s. And then I wanted to do a third book on the very end of the 20th century, the sort of 90s into the early 2000s. So it was always going to be three, really.
and are you working on the third one?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. So the book about your good self and your fabulous work is the sort of, although it stands alone, well-beings, here it is again. There you are. Although it stands alone, and tells a very particular story, it's got that. Well, I hope that it has that kind of combination of a through line, a story, recurrent characters in the book. There's some characters that recur from the first book, but it's also got analysis, lots of different examples, hopefully quite unexpected examples put together. So that's the second book. That's the
Uh,
book about the 70s. And yeah, the third one, quite at an early stage at the moment, but it is underway about the end of the century, about the 1990s, about people variously trying to disappear from the century or move away from the future in some way. There's a lot of millennial angst in the book about the 90s.
Anything on
Um,
Y2K? Was that a phenomenon in your
Oh
life?
yeah, I mean the whole idea of what is the millennium going to bring, which you have both techno anxiety, but also various forms of what you might call kind of new age anxiety, things like Heaven's Gate. I'm very interested in as well, and also the idea of the year 2000 being a kind of turning point, variously interpreted as both good and bad.
Heaven's
Although
Gate. That was a movie?
No, that well, it was a film, but it was also it was the film that had the legendary reputation of sinking the studio, Michael Cimino. But in the 1990s, Heaven's Gate was the name of a sort of semi-religious techno cult who became famous or infamous because they became a suicide cult and they killed themselves en masse in the late 1990s to
Ah,
try and catch a ride on Halley's Comet. They said that there was a UFO behind Halley's Comet that would take them away from Earth, and they had to
where
sort of leave their bodies behind.
was that in England or here or
No,
where?
that was in California.
I missed that. Huh.
Yeah, it was a chap. It was led by a chap called Marshall Applethwaite, and they lived together, and they were all very interested. I mean, he has his origins in terms of sort of cultish behavior into the mid to late 1970s, where he started sort of gathering people together. But the incarnation of the group in the 1990s, it was a sort of weird combination of I suppose secular spirituality. They used to build websites for people, so there's a lot of sort of techno philosophy there. But they were also the group themselves were also very interested in science fiction. They used to watch a lot of Star Trek, X Files, and they talked about their movement beyond. They talked about their effectively their suicide as leaving the holodeck. they saw
Fascinating.
themselves in a kind of
Yeah.
simulacra that they were moving on from by trying to leave the Earth and join the UFO behind Halley's Comet. Um, so they're a very interesting group because in one ways, they achieved the goal of a lot of the cults and communes that I'd encountered in the 60s and 70s because they'd become a autonomous, self-sufficient group with its own income stream, right? They'd sort of made it. And yet there's this other difficult, problematic level that involves their mass suicide, but is it's very different to Jim Jones and Jonestown. It's not it's no way as nihilistic as that. So yeah, they're the kind of group that I'm interested in for the 90s book because it's got something about leaving the earth behind. That's the response almost that's the response to the approaching millennium. You've got to like leave the century, leave history, leave the earth behind. So I'm kind
How
of
many
charting that idea. Say again, sorry.
how many of them were there? Like hundreds or
No, there wasn't hundreds, not at all. It's quite a small group of, I think it was about 20 or 30. And they'd lived together for quite a while. And there were a couple who didn't join with them in the actual suicide. And they became sort of almost like flame keepers for the group subsequently, like continuing to talk about them. But no, it's quite a small group, quite a tight knit group. Um, interesting set of ideas, difficult set of ideas, but it's that kind of, I see that elsewhere within the culture of the period. There's artistically, creatively, and also physically, in their case, there's almost this desire to kind of disappear, to sort of vanish, to leave the century, to not almost not confront the encroaching millennium, um, to disappear in various ways. So that's kind of what this third book's about, is charting that feeling, that tone.
now we have the concern with the impending nuclear war or AI destroying us and bunkers in New Zealand for the
Mm.
billionaires and like hope
Yeah.
you're able to get it published that we're still
Yeah,
here
well,
to
I hope so. That I mean, I hope I want to get it published before time runs out, as it were.
exactly.
There is. I mean, there's the desire is to get it published so it can connect with some anniversary in the 90s, but the desire might be significantly more mortal than that. Like I want to finish the book before the world actually ends. But it's interesting that similar anxiety is going on here, and
Yeah.
again, a lot of what we're dealing with sort of has its origins in the 1990s in terms of the arrival, commodification, the availability and the commercialization of the internet, and particularly Amazon, AI, and has its
Mhm.
origins in just in the form that we're now dealing with it, has its origins in the 1990s. Bitcoin and cryptocurrency have their
Yeah.
origins in the 1990s. So, and I think a lot of where we are in terms of the political situation, the status of, the sort of slightly spectacular status of politicians across the political spectrum, that kind of personality politics, also I think has its origins in the 1990s with the arrival of a certain kind of celebrity culture. Um, so yeah, these projects are always looking in both directions. It's trying to chart, sort of looking into certain historical periods, but trying to unpack kind of contemporary ideas, which is what I was trying to get at the 70s book, really. That,
Yeah, let's go
you know,
back to that of
of
how you
course, yeah, absolutely. That's the reason why
transition.
we're talking, for goodness sake.
Like, when did you first even hear the word wellness? Like, as Dan Rather said in our 60 Minutes piece, it was a seldom used word in the
Yeah.
70s. But what your transition from the 60s book to even getting the idea for well-beings?
Yeah.
Where did you come up with the title and the idea of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, to kind of fill you in, the original title for this book was going to be Headspace. That was the
Oh,
original title because I was very interested in that, in what that interior movement and the way
yeah,
in which the 1970s had been talked about as this culture of narcissism and self-regard. So
yeah,
the point I was trying to do with is that seemed to me to come from a desire to turn inward for a variety of ways. And we actually changed the title, interestingly enough, because as because of search engine optimization, because there's a meditation app called Headspace. Um, and that was one of the points I was going to make in the book anyway, that there's a shift in the way in which that phrase was used from a kind of attitudinal idea. What headspace are you in? Are you in the right headspace to go
Hmm.
on this protest march? Can you get in that
Yeah.
headspace? Um, Two, headspace has sort of become this kind of inviolable sense of self, your own private fortress of solitude that you move into because you want some me time. That shift was kind of the thing that I was interested in, like what happened to the sort of stereotype. And I'm aware that when I'm talking here, again, I didn't live through the decade. What I mean is, this is the kind of the received cultural historical perspective that I've encountered and am thus questioning that when we think about the 1970s, one of the stereotypical stories of it is there's a big political push, particularly on the basis of the left in the 1960s. For whatever reason, that seems to dwindle. You know, Apparently, I don't really agree with that, but it seems to dwindle in the 1970s. And what seems to be replaced by that is a focus on the self, a culture of narcissism, and so on and so forth. I wanted to find out where that came from. I wanted to actually unpack, how did that circulate? Where did that come from? But I was also very much aware of the fact that, if we talk about that from a contemporary perspective, we've got a lot of that culture already, not just in terms of social media, but it's there in the wellness industry. So I was aware of the wellness industry in terms of it being a contemporary repository of these same ideas. It's all about self-regard, narcissism. It's people who are already financially well off, paying for a certain kind of experience, a status-driven experience. And I was aware of what that term signified in a contemporary sense. Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, for example, a lot of
Hmm.
other, when we think about wellness, it's a kind of branding for often prestige, i.e., expensive products, which you can get elsewhere if you look at elsewhere and often in the same shop for less money. Here in the UK, you can go to supermarkets and there is a wellness aisle, and they basically 9 times out of 10, if you go to the wellness aisle in the supermarket, you'll find expensively branded products of vitamins, but the same shop will have own brand in
Really?
another section, which is a lot cheaper. So all that wellness seems to do is just big up the price of the same thing that you can buy. So it seemed to have this implication of celebrity-driven, expensive products aimed at people who effect may want them but didn't actually need them. Um, the general idea from the book was to try and trace the origins of that stereotype of the 70s as being about the self rather than the wider community, and the sort of apparent political compromises that came with that, to trace that through a variety of different forms of popular culture, to sort of hint towards the fact that those ideas are fed into the contemporary perspective. And obviously that's a big set of ideas. So when I was actually then began to think about how do I actually narrativize this, how do I get a through line, what I really didn't want was just a book that was chapter by chapter, a different idea, a primer to lots of different ideas. I wanted there to be a through line. I wanted there to be a cast of characters. I thought, what is the kind of anchor that can really put this together? And that is to effectively to sort of chart, to use this word wellness as my chart through the 1970s, to use that as the kind of linchpin, the intellectual linchpin, as what is the idea that we're dealing with here, but also to use that as the kind of spine to connect the different characters, events, text, books, projects, whatever. So it seemed to me that one big shift that you could look to and point towards, before you even get to actually interpreting the stereotypes or not, is there seemed to be almost an idea of a shift at some point in the late 1960s and into the 1970s of this idea of being free to being well, right? Rather than living free and getting things for free, actually living well, living better. And I became very interested in it once I started to move a little bit more backwards, a little bit, go into a little bit more depth, think about the post-war period, think about Halbert Dunn, thinking about the World Health Organization, thinking about the state of things in the British and American post-war period. Certainly, the Beveridge report here in the UK, the debate surrounding Medicare and Medicaid, the sort of GI Bill, and so on and so forth in America. All there seemed to be a very interesting politics connecting all that together, which I thought I could also uncover and again push through a certain history of the 1970s. That was kind of the idea. So I'd always been very interested in that image of the 1970s of, it's the decade in which the hippies start to do yoga, right? Again, stereotypical, all those images of strange, peculiar sort of cultural centers, places like Esalen, but the way in which they have a reputation, again, in the popular culture as being these enclaves of either high strangeness or weirdness. I know that's not the case in terms of their actuality, but there's various popular culture examples that show that. So it was always a period that I was very interested in, that period of I suppose a kind of inner space, an interior retreat. And I knew that there was lots of texts and works and artworks that I could draw upon to work with, but actually specifically taking a long, hard look at wellness specifically, that was the anchorage. That's the linchpin that I thought the book really needed.
Now, how did you run across Halbert Dunn? You mentioned him already.
Yeah. Yeah, it was doing some preliminary research really. It was doing some work just trying to find where did this word actually come from. Doing some etymological work on it. What is the history of the word wellness? Following things from dictionaries, doing some preliminary searches, and then I came across some of Dunn's articles, um, and building it up from there, following the reference points really. And again, thinking that his background was really interesting, and I thought that for me, it really started to get interesting because I thought, well, it's Dunn's work and the emergence of high level wellness pretty much parallels the kind of ideas that Aldous Huxley was talking about in the publication of Ireland in the early 1960s and his lecturing on human potential again in the early 1960s, out of which the Esalen Institute came. Once I was always aware of Huxley's work, and once I got hold of Halbert Dunn as a name connected to wellness and started to investigate his work, but then put it together chronologically, I saw that the emergence of his writing and his publications pretty much paralleled that of Huxley, who is a much bigger name in terms of the sort of 1970s counterculture and there's a much more direct line of influence between Huxley and the rise of the Esalen Institute. But Dunn was saying very similar things at pretty much the same time. And I think that it had a much more practical politics connected to it. So as soon as that link was made, and in terms of a research link, I thought there's an untold story here, and there's a way that we can sort of, you can tell the kind of Huxley Esalen story, but there's a whole territory here, which is kind of much more interesting because he's given you answers, he's given you solutions, there's like a model here that could be applied. And so it was following the links from there, trying to figure out where this work had been taken up, who else had talked about this work, putting it together, sort of putting the threads together. But really getting a sense that there's something really viable and useful, certainly from a contemporary perspective, in terms of what Dunn was saying, particularly if you then compare what he means by wellness to what wellness typically signifies today. There was something that you could really unpack there. Because if you talk at someone like Huxley, Huxley's reputation, I mean, from a literary critical perspective, there's always the oscillation in terms of which of his novels and which of his texts are gaining prominence. But when you think about Huxley's work in the 1960s, it occupies a certain kind of sphere, and yet Huxley's writing on human potential, it's kind of interpreted in the same way, and it's sort of understood and coded and framed in a very particular way, and that's fairly consistent. But there seemed to be such a difference between wellness as we understand it today as a brand, right? And wellness as Dunn was talking about it in the late 1950s and early 60s. It was so uh, almost diametrically opposed.
I've been struggling with that for 50 years.
Yeah, of course. And it was just like I thought there's this really, whether this is just my naivety and like obviously you know all about this. This is a linchpin to your career. Your colleagues know about this. It seemed to be just such a mirror image, and it's paralleled so many things that are better known. I just thought that this is the direction to pursue because it gives me
Uh-huh.
a story to tell, but it gives me something to argue against. It gives me it gives me that you're gonna learn something from this book that you think you know everything, you think you know what this means, when you go in the supermarket, etc., when you go on the expensive retreat, actually it means this. And that was just such a fascinating coin flip that I felt like that was the direction that I wanted the book to go in. Absolutely.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because I stumbled on the book by accident at the
Mhm.
bookstore.
Yeah, of
And then
course.
later, through getting copies of his papers through Don Ardell that his widow had given to him,
Mm,
and Don gave them to me because he was moving to
mm,
Florida and
mm,
didn't know what to do with them. And then I stumbled on the eulogies that were written about him and found out he had kids and all that. But the you actually found him through research and found the papers
mm,
that I
mm.
actually didn't know about till much later.
Well, I mean that's that. There's the value of digital repositories and things, and
Yeah.
it's easy to get hold of these things, but you can find if it's there in an academic journal, the repositories are wide enough and they're optimized enough that you can find it. But then they don't tell you what to do with them. They don't
Mm.
they don't come ready made in terms of their sort of explanation and their sort of significance. So, it sort of gradually developed in terms of what actually is the significance of this term, and what should one really be doing with it. So, as I said, I was trying to sort of tell a story, but I think there's a little bit of a polemic in this book because I think the other factor here is I remember quite distinctly having the first sort of discussions and meetings about the book with again the agent that same agent that I work with, and they said like we want a follow up to this 60s book. And I thought that's great. I want to write about the 70s, and we were kind of kicking ideas around, and we were on the same page in terms of I wanted to unpack this history of sort of inner space, if you like, in the 1970s and alternative health. That was the sort of idea that I work with. Um, but I remember very distinctly having that meeting in February 2020, right? And then we carried on talking about it, but like by March 2020, obviously things had changed quite distinctly,
Right.
um, for everybody. And suddenly health was very much in one's mind. And not just health, but I think what was actually certainly my experience of lockdown in the UK is that once the initial shock passed and the anxiety for, are my loved ones okay? Is everyone okay? And we sort of settled down into that new perspective. That was very revealing for me because it really foregrounded, I think, the extent to which I'd kind of been struggling with normal life, as it were, the pace of it, right? And I think one big thing that came out of lockdown was what is really important in human interactions. It's care, it's support, it's shelter, it's accommodation. We knew all this anyway, but a couple of months previously, we weren't prioritizing it. We were prioritizing getting to the next meeting, right? And that kind of acid bath experience of lockdown, where the absolute essentials came to the fore, um, that I think chimed very strongly with the stuff that I was beginning to read about how it had done in about when beginning to read your work, beginning to read Don Ardell's work. It was as if this kind of stuff that you were talking about in terms of human ecology, passing on health, about realizing one's potential, about not living miserably, about not being that it's not enough to be n not ill because you can achieve so much more, and about the idea that we're mutually connected in a kind of commonwealth and community of human individuals. That began to speak very loudly to me at that in that kind of early lockdown period. So I wouldn't say that the book is actually about COVID particularly, but the experience of it was it gave the majority of it was written during that period, and I think the whole experience very much, uh, if in some ways, kind of shone a light on the relevance of this, the importance of this, and it really brought out the importance of these ideas in that context. You know, you have to be okay to look after somebody else. You know, you got to start looking after each other as communities. We can't be in individual cells anymore. All of these ideas were really important, and also reading through, your book, Don Ardell's book. There are all those things about finding defining like stress triggers, thinking rigorously through one's routine in terms of where are the bad feelings coming from. There's little bits towards the end of Don Ardell's book where he's talking about changing a commute, changing the way the office is organized, talking to your boss about almost flexible working, thinking through your questionnaires about what they're actually trying to highlight in terms of what that talks about in terms of problematic patterns. All that I found incredibly relevant during lockdown because I ended up doing a lot of that thinking to try to think about my largely unhealthy routines leading up to that period, and then thinking I need to make changes coming out of this.
Oh, so what was you were smoking, drinking, and not exercising, or
No,
what?
I wasn't. I know. I neither drink nor smoke. I knew that I needed more exercise. I knew that my diet wasn't particularly good, but I knew that what passed for normality, a very highly stressful,
Uh-huh.
extremely busy lifestyle, was very unhealthy, and I was prioritizing the wrong things. And I could see the problems with my mood because as soon as lockdown happened, we're in a semi-apocalyptic. At one point, people thought it was an extinction level event. And what was my response? Relief. Relief that I didn't have to do the commute anymore. I'm thinking that's terrible. That is absolutely dreadful. Why am I so relieved that I don't have to do these things anymore? And that was a big sort of wake up call in the sense of if I'm preferring this to just the general pace of things leading up to it, maybe this explains why I was so angry all the time. Maybe this explains why I was feeling so depressed and anxious all the time, even
Ah,
before this thing happened, right? So so I was not just writing about this material. I was using your book, right, during this time. I did that. I went through that questionnaire. I was thinking about stress triggers. I was almost doing those exercises of thinking back through one's routine, when on the Dan Rather film where you're talking about the gentleman with the persistent headaches. I mean, yeah, I identified that with that very, very clearly. And there's another book that I came across called, which is very, which I think is actually, it might be, I may have come across it. I think I did actually read it as a result of reading your book. I think it might be referred to there as, Is It Worth Dying For? Do you remember that one?
who wrote it? That might help.
I can't remember. It's let me just very quickly look this up because this was a bit of a game changer in terms of my
Yeah, I don't
uh
recall it.
let me have a look.
Regina put a lot into the wellness workbook too, so it could have been something she knew
Yeah,
about.
it's Robert Elliott. Is it worth dying for? Yeah, from this is from the 1980s. So I do again. Excuse me if I'm misremembering, but it was from a. I came across it just referencing quite. There was a number of books I was reading at the same time, and this came out, and that was really Robert Elliott is very interesting because he describes himself as, an academic entering his 40s, no history of cardiovascular disease. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, no family history of any of this. But he said that he described himself as being very driven. He wanted to achieve certain positions by certain times, and he said that he found himself on what he called a kind of joyless treadmill of one seminar after another, one conference after another, one teaching zone after another, traveling around the country doing all this. And then he realizes one day in the middle of a conference that he's having a heart attack. And obviously, professionally, that's what he treats. He knew all the signs, and he took himself off to the emergency room and presented himself as such, and basically says, "I'm having a heart attack. This is what you need to do, and you need to do it quickly because I'm about to pass out." And and then and then the book is him sort of saying it was stress that was leading to this, and it's a combination of a study of the actual physical effects of it. This is how stress leads to a heart attack. This is what it is. But it was also unpacking that, well, what is I willingly put myself in that situation. What was I trying? This didn't happen because I had a bad diet or no exercise. This happened because I was pursuing these peculiar self-imposed goals. So, I read that as an example of, I wanted to get a few examples in the book of first person narratives and think about them kind of narratologically, as well as the novels that I was reading. And then I just thought, like, this is, put the science, it's not my discipline, of course, but everything else is ringing quite true here. As I was, sat up all night trying to get the next draft of this chapter in, etc., etc. Why am I actually doing this? Is this the healthiest thing to do? So yeah, the point being is, it wasn't just a kind of intellectual interest and a sort of just a follow on from the first one, as it were. Although that's kind of there. I found myself getting an enormous amount out of the material I was working with, which helped me very much to understand some of the
Mm.
patterns, physical and psychological, that I'd been following up until that point. And since then, I've tried to change because it's only going to go one way, really.
So Ardell wrote his book before I even had the Wellness Center
Mm.
uh, running,
Yeah.
or around the same time. So how did you encounter, like the Wellness Workbook came 5 years after that?
Yeah.
How did you stumble on that? Or I'm just
Well,
curious.
I mean, it was literally a case of casting the net as wide as I possibly could. In those first, when I got the idea, and I thought, is there anything in this? Well, let's see what material is there. Let's search through library catalogs. Do as many and as deep searches as I possibly can. Let's try on the general concepts. And just for my own purposes, what I wanted to do was to get a set of, if you like, primary text together. So as I started looking into it from Halbert Dunn's perspective and started joining the dots and looking for other articles and so on and so forth and other publications, what are the names that start coming up? Your name started coming up. Don Ardell's name started coming up. Okay, that there you are. I can see that has been quite persistent. What are the books connected to those names? And then I went from there. So lots of library searches, getting together a kind of bibliography for myself, really, working out what are the commonalities between those texts. Are there shared text between them in their own bibliographies? Are there names recurring in those texts? Can I get like a timeline and a chronology together from my own point? And I think that was sort of the difference between the two books in terms of the experience of doing it, because everything that I wrote about in the 60s book, The Bad Trip, was, I mean, it was already fairly well known and narrativized. The Manston case is very famous. The Rolling Stones at Altamont is very famous. The moon landing is very famous. The sort of trick there, I suppose, to make it interesting was choosing the angle and choosing the examples. Well, certainly, and I was familiar with a lot of this stuff from the 60s. When I was going into this, I was less familiar with, if you like, the basic narrative. So I found myself having to do quite a lot of work just for my own purposes of kind of joining these texts together, seeing which came first, which came before the other, getting some kind of sense of the life cycle of these texts, the shared names, the connections between the two, can I find videos, interviews, stuff in other journals, and so on and so forth. Um, so I had to do quite a lot of work constructing that for myself before then going into, well, what's the narrative going to look like in the actual book itself? What are the other examples? But that actually came relatively quickly. And once I found that there were, as it were, primary text linked to these names, your wellness workbook, Don Ardell's High Level Wellness, the way that they connected to Halbert Dunn's work, I got a copy of Halbert Dunn's book as well. It was good to see those things out on the table, really.
What I'm curious is that I hardly mentioned the Wellness Resource Center in the Wellness
Mhm.
Workbook. We had closed it. It was a economic failure. I was off to Costa Rica to try to recover
Mhm.
from that period of time. Regina and I had written it during the final days of the center. So, but much of your citations are about the Wellness Center,
Yeah, of
which
course.
no one else seemed to know about. I was shocked.
Well, actually, the first time I came across it, I watched the video interview that you and Ardell did at the Wellness Summit, and I think it was in
Oh, okay.
it was a good long interview, and in there was loads of material. I sat there and I watched the video, and I thought I'd already heard of you and Don. And I basically, frankly, as I was waiting for the books to arrive that I ordered, I then went and investigated to see if there was any videos or interview
Oh,
content. And that was the first one that I came across. And I thought it was a really good interview in which you were given a lot of time to explain this stuff, and the interviewer obviously knew his stuff, and it was the
yeah,
right
he was good.
audience. Yeah, and then there was just loads of stuff in there, and I watched it through, and then I made a transcript of it, and I kind of pulled out the things that I was most factually interested in, and then used those to kind of build up a set of what I wanted to look in further. So I do remember that the Resource Center was mentioned in that. Marin County was mentioned in there. That was where I came across the point that you made about your reasons. You knew that you talked about Marin County as being a kind of wealthy ghetto of unhappy people. And that stuck with me. I think, well, what's all that about? Is there something else about that area? So once I started looking into that area, I came
Oh,
across Simon McFadden's book and blah blah blah. So it just started. That's once what I look for when I'm doing these projects, which do intentionally bring a lot of stuff together. I look for the stuff that once you start thinking about it, it starts to grow. So that interview in particular it gave me a really good sense of your personalities, and I could see what you were agreeing on and slightly departing from in terms of your own outlook. So that was really instructive. It gave me a clear sense that you knew each other and had known each other for a long time. So that was really illustrative as well. The deference and the respect from the interview was obviously very clear as well, which kind of reiterated a sense of kind of gravity around you. So I thought, well, these two guys, these are obviously the two guys to actually follow here. But I then just tried to follow up and flesh out the factual information connected to other things. And then I found some other very interesting interviews. I came across, I think that interview actually had a clip from the Dan Rather piece in. I found that again, other versions of that shortly afterwards. And I also one I found very interesting from you was the one that you gave to a sort of, I think it was, forgive me if this is not the right way to talk about it, but it was a sort of community group where you talking, it was a kind of
right. It's
autobiography night.
yeah. I was astounded that you found that because I was the first one to record it. They'd done about 10 of them when they started that
Yeah.
series. It's a retirement community where I live when I'm in
Mm-hmm.
California. And I decided to record it. And I stuck it up somewhere on YouTube. And then they decided to record them all after that. And they
Mm-hmm.
created their own channel. But how you found that is
I
astounding.
mean, again, it was just doing searches, and again, the thing is you can find this stuff. The question is like, what do you do with it? What does it tell you? What the reason I found that really interesting is it reiterated a lot of the information and sort of corroborated a lot of the information that I'd got from the other interview. But it told me a lot about your storytelling style, your
Hmm.
personality, the way in which you're emphasizing one thing to another. If I was very moved by the fact that you were clearly quite moved talking about Halbert Dunn. That is extremely revealing. So for someone, my perspective at that point was I was trying to get a sense of sort of get things informationally correct, but I did want a sense of people's personalities that I was also trying to put into the book. All this is for someone trying to, as it were, for the historian looking at this stuff. That is incredibly important information. And then I found a couple of lectures that you'd done, again, talking about similar things, but in a very different sort of
Oh,
setting.
that one in Czech Republic that I didn't even know
Yeah,
had been recorded
yeah,
until
well, I mean, there it was, but again, there, it's again what you, it's, you can with the right keywords, you can find, as I'm sure you can find things. The question is, what does it tell you, and what do you do with it?
yeah.
And again, it corroborates things, but it shows your style, your personality, all of which is really important. I also got a lot actually out of your appearance on the thing for Vogue as well with
Oh,
Camille Rowe.
yeah. I don't even. I haven't looked at that for years. I forgot.
Mm,
I flew down to LA and spent a day with those characters and
mm.
didn't know whether it was worth it or not.
No,
Uh,
it's worth it. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
but thanks for reminding me. I have to go
Mm,
back and look at that. But just for viewers in the future who may not realize that all of these, well, they're saying they're going to put the interview with Ardell and me, since it's the Global Wellness Institute that's
mm,
sponsoring this first version of my oral history
mm,
project that we're
mhm,
hoping to get off the ground.
mm,
And I've narrowed it down to about 50 of the 100 and some interviews. There's a PDF that you can download that has
mm.
links to all of those folks.
Right.
So, did you listen to Halbert's daughter-in-law describing him? Have I sent you, or did you find that link?
You sent me a lot of the transcripts, I think, from I think a memorial service.
No, there's
And
actually, I found his daughter-in-law
I see,
who
right.
was of the second son, I think.
Hmm.
All three of his sons had died, but the second son
Hmm.
had just died. And through his granddaughter, I found her mother and I
Hmm.
interviewed her by phone. And
I
she
see.
goes into all the quirks of uh, HL, is what they called him, uh,
Hmm.
Halbert Lewis.
Hmm.
And it was a fascinating picture of um someone who wasn't real popular because he had left his family, the three
Hmm.
sons. And
Hmm.
uh, there was I didn't even know about them until I stumbled on the eulogies. But
Hmm.
she does give a picture of who he
Hmm.
was as a person
Hmm.
more
Hmm.
than anyone else, and I'm so
Hmm.
glad because she died a year or two later.
Oh, I see.
Uh,
Hmm.
if you haven't heard that, it's
Oh, I'll listen to that very much so. Yeah.
delightful. Uh, she's quite a character in
Hmm.
herself.
Hmm.
But so you managed to put all this together and gave me an appreciation for my work that I hadn't had before of the uniqueness of it as um, I tracked down one of the guys I had actually done training in transactional analysis. We ran groups together before I moved to California to start the
Hmm.
center, and then I brought him out. He was doing a master's in social work in Baltimore, and he had a break for the summer, so he came out and helped out on our staff and never went
Hmm.
back.
Hmm.
But I found him after 50 years living in Kauai just
Hmm.
back in April and got together with him. We were coming back through Hawaii on our return to California. And I recorded him similarly, realizing that we were just making it up as we went along. We had no idea what we were doing. And you gave us a perspective that it wasn't all as crazy as we thought, but it really did feel like it was just by the seat of our pants. And we had all of our upsets with the faculty or the staff that I'd created, the original staff, after we did a family constellation type um, session where I was the dad and they were all the kids. And
Hmm.
then two of my key people left at that point, and I
Hmm.
brought in another whole group that it became much more egalitarian. And all of that stuff that, just we were completely on our own. And then to make your connection with the serial, which
Hmm.
we were reading at the time, because
Yeah.
it was the editor of the Pacific Sun who interviewed me for the Sun, and that was um, our favorite read every week of just what's going on in Marin County, because at that point it was really powerful investigative journalism. They exposed a number of things, and
Mm,
now it's a kind of pathetic ad thing. But Steve McNamara is long gone.
mm.
Uh, but we were reading the serial, and then it became a book, and then the movie. What is um, um, what's his name? Short. The star of it that plays
Yeah,
Harvey.
it's what's he called?
Mar-
Martin something or other.
Martin. Yeah.
Martin Mull or something. I
Martin
can't
Mull,
remember.
yeah. He
Yeah.
says the worst best movie, best worst movie ever made.
I think it said something like if they showed it on a plane, people would leave.
I remember that. But she really did capture the era. And then I listened to the Mill Valley Library's oral history of
Mm.
her. Did
Yeah,
you get a
yeah.
chance to listen to that? Of
Yeah,
how
yeah, it's good, it's good, it's
she
good.
had to leave she was getting hate mail, had tires slashed. These Marin people who were similarly behaved the same way during COVID. Uh,
Mm.
it was shocking, and so that was a real gift for me to go back and see the context that
Mm.
she was in and how she
Mm.
created all that. So anyway, and in the midst of all this, at some point you became a professor and started teaching. And uh, uh, let's go back just to follow that thread for a minute of how
Mm.
you wound up staying at Cambridge and
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I did the PhD and then I got a sort of research position, which is the sort of typical thing that you might do. You become a postdoctoral
uh-huh.
project. Um, and then one thing Cambridge is actually very good at. Cambridge is it's not one singular university, one singular entity. It's actually made up of 31 different colleges. And within the complicated way in which Cambridge organizes things, there's the opportunity to do quite a few different jobs, and there's also the opportunity to do quite a lot of freelance work at the same time. So as I came out of essentially those studies, I then started to do teaching. I started to work for some colleges. I started to work for the faculty in a professional context. And I kept that up. And one thing I wanted to do is every time I took on a different role, I wanted it to be like a step up. I wanted it to add something more to it. The slightly problematic flip side of those opportunities that Cambridge offers people, like I said, there's a lot of work if you look for it, is the trade effectively on a kind of freelance basis. It's difficult to uh, gain a permanent foothold, and you've either got to be lucky on the first strike, or you've got to be persistent enough to almost kind of cultivate it for yourself. So I took the route of trying to build something up. I did the kind of typical sort of portfolio career. But once I then got attached to Girton College, which is one particular college, in about 2015, I was able then to build that up into something more permanent, which actually came around. You were sort of I was given the permanent role in about 2019, around the time of the first book. So that then sort of takes us to where I am now. So I work for the college. I'm a fellow of English, but I also work with all the postgraduates. I basically run the postgraduate team as well. So it's a good role. There's a lot going on. But again, reflecting on a lot of this work that I was doing for this book, um, there's a lot of the work that I actually do outside of the research, outside of the teaching, effectively comes down to working with student and particularly postgraduate welfare. So I see kind of firsthand a lot of the stresses, pressures that postgraduate students are under, and again thinking about things from this context has actually been quite useful in trying to, as much as I'm able to. I'm not necessarily a therapeutic professional, but as much as I'm able to try and get into that mindset and kind of advise people and sort of suggest ways in which people might change things. Certainly when the conversation comes down to routines and how people actually conduct their work, it's often quite useful to have that kind of conversation with people who are finding things difficult, and you can sometimes help them out from this kind of perspective.
You could pass out copies of Is It Worth Dying For?
Of course, that's what I mean. That, yeah, I've been trotting that out like no one's business. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, there's increasingly so. There's a time, which is now when I started as a student, the image of postgraduate students was, if you were lucky to get there, you could do a lot of work and a lot of research, and if you sort of persisted, the life of an academic was the life of sort of continual research. That's kind of gone. And what the postgraduates are now moving towards is an increasingly competitive and increasingly more entrepreneurial professional life and an increasingly more precarious life. So doing the actual work of a postgraduate is incredibly stressful, but they're also more and more moving into an incredibly stressful professional zone. So you know, from a welfare perspective, I try to work to ease this as much as possible and help people as much as possible while they're here.
I suppose if too many of them quit, you'll run into trouble with the university. But
Yeah, I mean, you want people through. I mean, we
yeah,
want to be conferring those qualifications, but I don't think that having a miserable time and being really stressed and being as is I don't think that's an index of success. I think sometimes there's
no.
the marker of, yeah, if I burn myself out, that will be a sort of that's evidence that I'm doing well and I'm doing enough work. And I know that because that's what I used to think.
Mhm.
I used to have, that's the kind of hyperactive sort of working class like Puritan work ethic, that there's a sort of ennobling thing in working to exhaustion, but the only thing that produces is more exhaustion. So, or what it basically boils down to when we do the opening induction talk at the start of the year, which we're sort of planning now, is we basically say to the students, look, we want you to be healthy and happy. We want you to be healthy, happy, and successful. That is our main aim. We're not saying to you that, we're not going to stand here and say you've got to work your absolute hardest and have no fun and all this kind of stuff. You are part of a community, and we want you to be healthy within it, and that makes for a healthy community overall, which can also
Mm.
feedback beneficially to you. Um, so yeah, there's a lot in terms of the job, which is not just working in a particular area teaching a particular area. You're working with very particular individuals who are under very particular stresses, and a lot of that is often made manifest in quite an intense way, which you also have to deal with. There's a lot of triage involved. There's other people who are more qualified to deal with anxiety disorders and so on and so forth,
Mhm.
but can often get things presented to you quite directly, either in a teaching context or a tutorial context. And one gradually develops a kind of an approach to deal with that. And I certainly see that from the kind of things that the students are talking about resonates with the kind of thing that I was getting from your work.
To pull on another thread, do you have you had time for a family or relationships, or what's your agenda?
Well, I'm very close to my family. I have a partner here in Cambridge. That's as far as it goes. We're again tight unit.
So, what do your parents think of all of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, very. I mean, they're not. They tell me that they're very proud. I have no reason to doubt that. Not even in my most terribly anxious and zero self-esteem moments. I think they like the kind of the appearance of the books. It's something that can be shown as a sort of tangible result of all this work. And I think, yeah, I mean, it comes down to the fact that there's it follows through the logic of the kind of things that they were teaching my sister and I. They wanted to develop our creative interests, our intellectual interests. They wanted to instill a kind of work ethic. Um, Much of I can trace my interests in this period to what I've got from my parents. Look at this, you might like it. Listen to this record, you might like it. Watch this film, you might like it. I have very vivid early memories of watching things like 2001: A Space Odyssey with my father, because he hitchhiked down to London to watch it when it first came out, and he wanted me to watch the spectacular psychedelic ending of it, and I watched that
Yeah.
when I was about 5 years old. He said, "Watch this. You have to watch this." So everything that I'm kind of interested in, it comes from my mum and dad.
Uh-huh.
They've kind of passed this. I didn't learn about Aldous Huxley and William Burroughs and meditation retreats from the Shakespeare Center at Lancaster University. I learned about it from my parents.
Uh-huh.
And the university, I suppose, equipped me with the tools and the technologies to actually put it into a project. But pretty much everything I'm interested in, either comes from them or they encouraged it. They found out what I was interested in. They pushed me more in the direction of it. You like that, here's more of it. So they're very pleased with it.
Are there any other threads you can think of as we wrap up to broaden or widen or fill out what your amazing life has been? And
I don't know. I mean, the thing is, um, that's very, 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 very kind. I think you have the amazing life. That absolutely. I guess the thing is, towards the end of doing the book, I became more and more, uh, concerned and eager to sort of extract lessons. Like, what can we learn from this? And the first one was very much like, what can we learn from this in terms of, what does it tell us about how the 60s are represented and stuff like that, which is a kind of valid point. But I think that the difference with this one, it was much more in terms of what is this work actually teaching us that we need to do now. And I think when people were reading through it,
1 o'clock.
I really wanted them to get that, and I really wanted to get the sense of this thing that you kind of take for granted, which is sort of a part of the cultural thread, which in some ways is not really taken seriously. It's sort of like, well, that's just what kind of rich people do who are already doing well already. It has a real radical politics feeding into it. And if we can kind of remember what that was, we would be in a better position now. You
hmm,
know, we kind of need that going forward, right? We need to remember what that was, and that can help us out, you know. So that's the more polemical element of it, and that's beyond the. I think someone in some of the reviews, they were sort of saying, it's got great anecdotes and stuff like this, and it's got great characters. Great, good. I'm glad that people have got that, and that's a reflection of the greatness of the people who are in it, i.e., you. Um, but what I also would also want people to get from this is what can we do with it? What can we
hmm,
use this? How can we learn from this and maybe put it to work in our daily lives? And ultimately, I'd like people to go back to this material and back to the primary material and see how relevant it is to our current predicament. And I do think we're in a predicament. It needs serious rewiring and recalibration. But the material to do that is already there. We have like performance reviews, 360 reviews. We're feedbacked to oblivion. We've got all the infrastructure and mechanism there, which is monitoring us in all kinds of ways in terms of our performance. And I mean this in terms of my own workplace. I don't see, for example, why you can't factor into this effectively a session where you go, "Are you okay? How are you feeling?" Where you can't actually factor into that. Here's a performance review. Now go and see the in-house counselor to talk
hmm,
about this stuff. The structure is already there to do this, but we still don't prioritize that actual person to person. Well, we talk about it colloquially. Where my workplace is very good at saying, how are you doing, how are you getting on. But I think one way we could do this is actually kind of roll out that real, genuine, non-empty question, how are you? And I think that your work speaks really loud to that. It's so easy to say that question, how are you, as a kind of conversational opener, but it takes a lot of commitment to actually shut up and listen to what comes back, right?
hmm.
Which I think your practice is effectively all about, that really close listening and analysis to what kind of comes back to that. Yeah, I think if I wanted anyone to take one thing from that, it would be, how can we actually systemically work into our professional lives that how are you, you know, and not have that as a marginal and really do something with what comes out. Give people the time to really think about it, and then give the system the time and the resources to really do something with that. That is what I would like to see.
Wonderful. Those are great closing comments. And I'm going to end the recording and thank you again for your uh, wonderful expansion of my sense of history as I put together my history of the people that influenced me early on, and then your perspective of how that's influenced you. It's been a wonderful full circle. So
Great. No,
thank
well,
you
again,
again.
thank you, because it's made the book, and I don't just say that in terms of thank you for giving me a book. Thank you for offering me the opportunity to explore your work. It's been really inspiring and invigorating in all kinds of ways.
All right. Well,